Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to present to you Dr. Leroy Nunnery.
Good evening, everybody. I told you not to read that.
I had to. I had
No, you
to.
didn't have
I
to, but
did.
I appreciate it. Hi, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. If I can do this right. Hold on one second, and we'll get into the mix of it. First and foremost, I hope everybody is well and that you're healthy and that you're whole. A friend of mine, somebody I've met through this whole insurance journey, just said their grandfather died today. And you know, even though I've never met the man, you feel for people at this moment because of the distance, because of the sickness, because of the malaise that we're in. And we're all trying to, recover, bounce back, and get through each and every week. So I hope that you're in a good frame of mind. We're going to move through all of this as quickly as we can because I really like to get into an exchange. In fact, I'm going to set my timer so that I don't go overboard. First and foremost, too, I'd like to thank the organizations for putting this together. This collaboration, Tracy, is phenomenal. Omari, I've known now for a few years. That's my man. He led the charge to get me into Liberty Mutual it's hard to believe, Omar, 3 years ago. And he's taken off now. He's an entrepreneur. And so I've already told him I'm going to give him some pointers on how to survive when the famine comes, but also enjoy the feast when it's here. Mark Mail, I met about a year ago at the Level Up conference that the Big I put on in New Orleans, and we immediately kind of struck up an accord. If you don't know Mark, you should. And he and Nick Fintrolakis, I believe, are also representing independent agents. And Nick, if I'm correct, knows a very good friend of mine, a childhood friend of mine, who just told me, Ed Wallace, who I've known since like 1960. So there's a lot of familial connections here too. I've seen some other names that came up on the attendee list, Shay Eskridge and others. So I'll give you your shouts out later. Tracy was kind enough to go through my background. I won't go through all of it here, but there are two individuals I'd really like to highlight. You see at the bottom right, Jesse Henry Nunery, kind of the patriarch of the family. Born in 1894, about 30 years after the end of the Civil War, and lived in a town, at least at the time, called Norwood, Virginia. Now, if you know Virginia at all, Virginia's a huge state. In between Charlottesville, where UVA is, and Lynchburg, where Liberty University is a county called Nelson County. Nelson County is not very big. It's agrarian. It's mostly agricultural. Norwood, where he lived, has about 400 people in it now. There's one stop sign, folks, no street lights, no stoplights. So when it goes dark in Norwood, it's dark. But he raised his family there right near the James River and, learned how to read. And somebody white taught him how to read as a kid. He got as far as the seventh grade because that's as far as they would ever educate colored folks at that time. But he took that knowledge, became a farmer, a chef on the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, a craftsman. So you see that porch he's sitting on? He built that house. He made his own shoes. And that go get 'em, that ambition, it was resonant in almost every member of my family. In fact, we have a motto, Nunnery's work, because that's what we do. His last child, the 12th child, is the guy called Clarence Leroy David Nunery, my pops, born 1934. So right as the Depression was kind of in the midst. And he came north with the Great Migration that Isabel Wilkerson has written about, the warmth of other suns, joined some of his brothers and sisters, and became an electrician. Now you may see something on his left ear there. He's smiling. We were actually in Norwood when I took this picture. In 1969, Nick, when I was going to Bergen Catholic High School in Oradell with Ed Wallace, my father was in a fire, an explosion. And there were 5 guys, they were cleaning, they were troubleshooting and doing some cleaning up at this printing plant. The solvent from fumes from a solvent ignited with a pilot light on a boiler, and it blew up. Two of the men immediately died. My father and the other two were able to scramble to safety, but about 30 to 40% of my father's body was burned. So what you see on his left ear is the result of a lot of skin grafts and pain. And if you've ever been around somebody who's been in a burn unit, you know what it smells like, the pain that they're in. But he took the workers' comp money, $10,000, and created Leroy Nunery and Sons. And every vacation, every summer, for the most part, that I was around him, that's why I ended up moving to Chicago, because I'd had enough. I was on the back of his truck. I learned how to run wires, to paint, to plaster, to lay bricks. I worked for myself. I have always hustled. So I am proud to be a multi-generational entrepreneur. And in 2007, when I started my business, as Tracy said, I focused heavily on education. But I got very fortunate in 2017 to be asked by Marsh to do a study called The Journey of African American Insurance Professionals, built on primary research, surveys, interviews, focus groups, secondary research with people like Dr. Robert Weems. You should look up if you ever want to get into the historiography of African Americans in economic development. We created this study. It's still out on the website. And in fact, Naya, as Omari may well know, has commissioned me to now do a second study. So we're going to update what we learned. And hopefully any of you who might be interested in being interviewed or surveyed will make contact with you. And then since that study has been out, with George Floyd's murder and Breonna Taylor and COVID-19 and DEI, this study has stayed alive. And in fact, you can see some of the names of places where I've been. By the time February ends, I will have presented close to 71, 72 times, and it's growing. I've had just this week 2 conversations that may take this work even further. So I'm not only proud of the fact that the study's out there, but I'm proud to have made associations with all of you, because this is work that I did not know. I was a banker, and I've done a lot of other stuff, but insurance has now captivated my attention, and we're trying to do as much as possible. Some of the places where the journey's taken me is what you see here, and I won't go through all of it, but I want to point out 2 interesting things here. You see the second to the left, the American Property and Casualty Insurance Association. I just wrote the narrative for a catalog, which you will soon see publicly, as we took the temperature of 52 P&C companies, all members of APCIA, to study their DEI practices. And we learned some very interesting things. We'll get to those in a second. And then there's another piece here that's really interesting on the end with the NAIC. And I saw Bernie Birnbaum may have tied in here. He knows all about the National Association of Insurance Commissioners and their special commission on race and insurance. So what I'm getting at here is the research has life, and what we're trying to do is leverage that research to make sure that what we do is spread the word and increase the volume. One of the key things that we learned from doing this study, talking to as many people as possible, is that there's some perceptions and realities. Limited access to opportunities, inequitable compensation, promotion, and evaluations, leaky pipelines, and lack of mentorship and sponsorship, unconscious bias, attitudes blocking acculturation, low visibility, particularly for folks of color, women, transgender, etc., and underutilized networks. All of these things are part of the complex of the perceptions. Now, for some people, they say, well, look, they're only perceptions, but if you're living them, they are realities. And one of those interesting realities is in this quote, because I believe that underrepresentation, particularly in the CPCU world, the independent agency world, and actuarial world, for example, it's more complicated than just counting heads. Here's a quote from the study. When I see an African American in the C-suite or a senior level position within an organization, I wonder, who did they know? Apparently, it's all about your relationships and not necessarily how hard you work in your professional role. And so later on, maybe if we get in a Q&A, we'll take a little temperature on that. Do you believe that? Is it about relationships or professional roles that you play? I think it's both. And in fact, when we asked folks in the study, are there obstacles that are greater for African Americans than other minorities? You see what the pie chart indicates, that for the most part, about 70% of the folks we surveyed said they strongly agreed, or at least somewhat agreed, that there are greater obstacles. Those perceptions are real to those of us who feel we are not going to get further ahead. There's nobody pulling for us. We are pulling for ourselves. Now, you may know that Marsh also recently did a study for Hispanic and Latin Americans in the insurance business, very much similar to the Journey study for African Americans. So on the left, you'll see figure 4. We asked about barriers, which could also be gateways, but these are barriers. What are the primary barriers for entry into the insurance industry for African Americans? Now, you could also break that down into becoming a CPCU, becoming a CLU, becoming a CPA, becoming anything. Lack of exposure, lack of networks, lack of experience are the top 3. Look on the right side, figure 7 there, for the updated or the new study that Marsh just did with Hispanic and Latin American insurance professionals. And that was actually sponsored by LAIA, the Latin American Association of Insurance Agents. Lack of exposure, lack of education, lack of experience, lack of networks. Very similar. So even though there are differences in culture, the barriers are perceived to be real. And one of the things we also found that career satisfaction actually had no correlation with whether or not how well you were getting paid, what sector of the industry, if it was health or life or general insurance, whether or not your job was an administrative assistant or an executive vice president, how much education you had, what designations you carried, or your age or your tenure. So the challenge to the industry is that individuals who are currently underrepresented, at least in number, also feel that while they could be satisfied with their careers, they're not getting as far ahead as they could. And I actually think that's a risk to the industry, that if you are not deploying talent in the way that you could, you are actually taking away shareholder value. The other thing we asked about is sponsorship and mentoring. You know, is sponsorship and mentoring highly recommended? And you see on the left side, figure 7, what ways would you recommend that to progress from trainee to executive levels? By and large, it was sponsorship and mentorship, 47%, and 36% said leadership development. On the job training, you would think would play a bigger part, but it did not. And on the right side, mentorships. Am I satisfied with my career? What we did was slice the data. And we saw that if you had a mentor, you were about 70%, you see, has a mentor, 70% agreed, if I had a mentor, that I could be satisfied. But those who did not have a mentor were almost about the same place. So one of the things that we're exploring is, how do you increase mentorship? Can the CPCU Society of Rhode Island work with the Big I, work with the institutes to create mentorship programs, even though they may not work for a specific company? Can you groom more people to replace those who are leaving because of retirement or because of consolidation? It's an opportunity. In the new Marsh study, they were asking participants, are Hispanics in the insurance industry having a high level of job satisfaction? 59% said yes. And if you add somewhat satisfied, it's about 94, 95%. So satisfaction is high. And yet, if you look at the next graph, DEI has increased, but progress has been slow. So has it increased significantly? Only 29% say yes, 61 say somewhat. Has the number in your company, number of Hispanics in your company increased? They've said it stayed about the same. So here's what's so interesting to me, anomalous to me. You've got an industry that needs people. You've got an industry that knows how to groom talent. You've got an industry that pays well. You've got people who will come to the industry and are satisfied to work in the industry. And yet the penetration into those new markets of talent aren't really being tapped. There's a sea change, folks, and I think you feel it, you see it. I was watching the last 3 days, the impeachment hearings. That alone is a signal that things are in flux. Jack Salzwedel, I've had a chance to meet at least virtually doing a panel presentation for APCIA, and he put out this blog right after George Floyd was killed, turning anger into action. At American Family, his company, we want the best talent, the best benefits, and the best company culture. We want strong communities that equitably serve everyone. All these things are rooted in our strategy. I want you to study that. All these things are rooted in our strategy. They are not ornamental. They're not something you just kind of say or put up the sign so that nobody will throw a brick through your window. If you believe this as a company, if you believe this as the CPCU Society, then they've got to be rooted in your strategy, because they show that we are absolutely committed to tackling the kinds of problems weighing our communities down today, because it's good for our communities and it's good for business. And if you notice, take a look at his t-shirt. Whoops, I'll have to go back here. Let's see, go here. I'm sorry, I blew that. Take a look at his t-shirt. Malcolm, Marcus, Medgar Evers. Boy, I'm skipping through here. Sorry. How is DEI embedded into the business? So in that APCIA catalog that I mentioned, and the results aren't out yet, so we can't go into so much detail, but I wanted to show you something related to what Jack was just saying. Majority of the companies that we survey said that diversity, equity, inclusion, you could add justice and belonging, are embedded in their business and practices and in their company culture. But when we asked, well, how does that translate into action? You may not want to study the whole graph, but here is the short of it. While 62% of the companies responded that DEI has been incorporated into strategic goals, only 27% of those companies have actually tied diversity, equity, inclusion into executive or manager performance objectives. And only 15% of that number have tied it into compensation. So, and you see the bottom bullet, 73% of the companies did not have DEI metrics included as KPIs. So you all are quantitative folks. You study numbers and data all the time. How is it that you can have a strategic goal but not bolt it down to how people perform and how they're paid? That's the next place that the journey has got to take us. And in Business Insurance Magazine, Andrew Toe did a survey, as they do every year. Is there systemic racism? And you can see that top bar on the right, on the left. All respondents of all the folks they asked, 39% said yes, there is, 39% said no, there's not, and 22% were unsure. But depending on the race of the self-proclaimed race of the person, you see the difference. White participants said only 31% said yes. Black participants said 86% yes. Hispanic participants 43%. Asian participants 53%. So that perception reality anomaly is still there. It's an unequal equation. It's a multivariate equation. When they asked about males versus females, you see men thought about 30% that, yeah, there is, but women thought even more so that there was. Look at the age breakdowns. Millennials say, yes, we think that there is systemic racism, but baby boomers like me in the 60s, like, oh, it really isn't there. We've conquered that. But we know that that's not true. Size of the company matters. Smaller companies don't feel as strongly about systemic racism as those companies that are larger. Now, is that possible because the populations inside the companies are larger, and at smaller companies you happen to know people a little bit better? Or is it that these smaller companies don't hire as much in terms of diverse populations? But here's the real kicker for me, the one at the bottom. The difference between buyers and sellers of insurance. Those risk managers that you are in front of all the time, only 26% said there's some type of systemic racism, but the sellers felt even more strongly that there was. And I've been in that chair, taking my little briefcase and my blue pinstripe suit and rep tie and white shirt and trying to pitch, services to some company. And they look at me like, yeah, but I don't know. And yet I'd find my idea being represented somewhere else. So sometimes it's in the perception of the individual, but a lot of times it's real. In the Marsh study, they asked, in the eyes of Hispanics currently working in the insurance industry, the sector is not representative of their culture. I won't go through all of this just because of time, but I urge you to go to the Marsh site and find and download the study. Look at figure 2. Only 14% of respondents believe that insurance companies employ the right number of Hispanics. Now, that's an open question. But you see, 63% of the folks said, no, there's not enough. And the market we know and the demographics are changing. So why is not representation higher? And on the other side, you see there's a broad feeling that senior management underrepresents Hispanics. Look at that line with 84%. Hispanics are underrepresented in senior management of most insurance companies. 84% of the people there believe that that is true. And if they want to rise to the top, they have to do it themselves. 71% say that. All of that says to me that not only are the companies not hiring enough, and that's something that the 3 or 4 organizations tonight can do to promote the cause, but also people feel that, wait a minute, I've got to do this. I got to row this boat all myself. Oops, there we go. So I have some probing questions around how we can underwrite a new future. Generally, in your practice, you look at risk factors. And Tracy and I talked about this in prepping. Characteristics, the profile of the materiality of a particular risk, hazards, probabilities. All of that is essential to how you assess whether or not to underwrite a particular risk or not. So I have some questions for you to ponder. Can CPCU Rhode Island assist in expanding participation of underrepresented groups in underwriting, which takes a long time to learn and is clearly one of the areas in all of the work I've done where you do not see enough folks of color or minorities that are come from underrepresented groups? Are minorities and people of color perceived as higher risks in achieving professional certifications? Big question. And then, is there an inherent risk to any company implementing DEI strategies? One of the things I've been trying to emphasize in all of the talking that I've done, and my time is winding down here, is that the key thing here is investment. You see that in italicized bold. This is not something, DEI that is, that you can solve for in a few days. It's not a quarter by quarter thing like managing earnings, managing revenues, or managing your SG&A line. This has got to be about a company's understanding that resources, time, energy, money, and people have to be dedicated to make this work. Because if something goes wrong, and it invariably will, there might be a tough hire, there might be some cause that didn't go well. You don't jettison the whole thing. It's fascinating how, in talking to insurance companies, you measure risk all the time. And yet when it comes to hiring people who are different or who can bring a different perspective, it seemed to be 100% risky. I don't get it. It's risk bearing when really it is not. The actual implementation of DEI programs, though, rests not in the hands just of the CEOs and people in the C-suite. It's in the hands of division and department heads, those people who day by day are managing the business. And in a piece that a book that's just come out, Be Intentional Culture, that the Diojo group has just put together, I've written a piece in there. We talk about corporate culture. And the question you should be asking is, if your culture, CPCU Rhode Island, Independent Agents of Rhode Island, the Institutes of Rhode Island, you've got to be asking if your culture has evolved by chance or if you've been intentional in developing it. And I won't read all of this, but ultimately what we're getting at is this. If your organizations, if those of you working for different companies, I know, say you've moved over to Travelers, for example, if you're really driving the business, then how do we do it with intention and with purpose? So here's some action. Whoops, here's some action steps that are being undertaken. In Canada, there's the Black North Initiative. They have created a global initiative similar to CEOs for Action, where they are on a mission to dismantle anti-Black systemic racism in corporate Canada. There are also a lot of initiatives going on in terms of accountability, where DEI is being tied to performance objectives. A major carrier, a PNC carrier, whom I won't name right now, that is actually doing is pushing this down because their chief diversity officer is key to making sure it happens. And she happens to report to the CEO, which gives it a lot of power, a lot of oomph. They're also creating KPIs and establishing some new ventures. Other action steps. So vertical integration. My company, Plus Ultra, was just named. We are helping with the Actuarial Foundation to build a school to career ladder where ultimately a diversity scholarship will be given to young people who want to come out of high school with some support, go on to college, study risk management and actuarial science, get internships, maybe apprenticeships, and move into into permanent roles. Apprenticeship US, Insurance Apprenticeship USA, college recruitment that NIA is doing with Impact, where we're pushing more information to HBCUs and minority serving institutions. The talent velocity studies going on. And then also companies like Lloyd's have decided that they're going to set a high bar to increase participation and representation to at least 3% in senior roles by 2025. There's also a lot of work going on in professional development. You know, the training that I'm doing, that I know Amari's into, trying to bring people up the curve. That's hugely important because people really don't know what they don't know. And everybody's afraid of making a mistake. But you know what? I'd rather have you try to make a mistake than not do anything at all. Wealth creation is huge. There's a fellow by the name of Eugene Mitchell and Ngozi Naji, who you may know, who's the chapter president for the Greater Hartford chapter of NIA, but also a board member of NIA, really pushing this whole idea of using insurance as a way to increase wealth creation in and amongst underrepresented communities. And insurance has a critical role in doing that. I think the CPCUs can actually help explain to people about what risk is and how their risk is different than someone else's, even in the same neighborhood. So financial literacy is a huge part of it. And then lastly, as I mentioned, extending the study of the journey. We're going to look at more career pathways, but I'm also starting to write about supplier diversity. You'll see more of that in terms of economic inclusion. So with that, I've reached my end. Tracy, I'll turn it back over to you. I want to say thank you all for your time and attention and just bearing with me and desiring to learn and desiring to get into a dialogue. So Tracy, back to you, and thank you all very much. I appreciate you.
I remember to unmute this time. Thank you so much. The chat has been hopping with all kinds of comments and you know that it's resonating with everyone. So what we'd like to do now is we would like to open this up for Q&A. Now they tell me that there is a way for people to raise their hand in the reactions. I don't seem to have that option. Um, so I want to, because there's a lot of us here, so I definitely want to have people, give people the opportunity to ask their questions, but I don't want it to become crazy. So I think what we'll, you know what, we're going to get creative here. What we're going to do is if you have a question or you want to make a comment, just type your name in the chat and then I'll call on you. We'll see if we work it that way.
And before we get into the questions, I got a note here from Shay. Shay's at Liberty. That was my fault. I think I said Traveler. Sorry, brother. I didn't mean to switch companies on you. I appreciate that. It's good to see you, though. Good to see you.
All right. So people are being shy. So I'm gonna I'm a talker. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna ask a question. Um, Someone made a comment in the chat. We were talking about mentoring, right? And if we think about the idea of mentoring people to bring them along, how do you balance? Because on the one hand, you would say, all right, you want people to get advancement based on their accomplishments, based on their ability to be effective in the position, just based on their credentials.
Sure, sure.
With mentoring, does that set us up for a situation where people are getting opportunities because of who they know? Like, how do you balance those two? And how do you, and I'm playing devil's advocate here a little bit,
Mhm.
how do you balance those two? And how do you make sure that a commitment to increasing diversity doesn't revert to something that looks like old school affirmative action?
Ooh, that's a loaded question. Um, I'm not even sure how to answer that except to say this. It's fascinating to me for an industry, and I don't mean to offend anybody, that is as nepotistic as insurance is. Where Mark, you'll appreciate this. In the study I've just done for the state of Illinois, for the Association in Illinois, the independent agents, we queried, I think we got 35 responses, and we asked independent agents, how did you enter the business? It wasn't through education. It wasn't through recruitment. It wasn't through an ad. It was a family connection. That's mentoring. So why do we think that, well, mentoring, if I mentor somebody who looks different than me or has a different orientation or religion, that's showing some kind of favoritism? I mean, it's just, to me, you mentor and you seek mentoring from somebody who can help you not only be better than you are, but also has a perspective and reach. Now, sponsorship is totally different because now, if I'm sponsoring Omari, that means I really not only have seen him perform, but I also am willing to vouch for him and put him in jobs and roles. I've done this over my career that may stretch his limits. Mentoring is more like coaching, but I think, we're really getting into a different era here. I don't think, I think we have got to be the ones, folks, at this time in our country, in this industry, to get rid of that nonsense. Well, that doesn't has nothing to do with it. The industry needs people. It's 300,000-400,000 shy of talent. So what are we going to do? Wait for everybody to keel over and then try to replenish? And believe me, even though there's artificial intelligence and predictive analytics, it's not going to take care of every job. You still have to have customer facing folks and underwriters such as yourself. So I'm not saying it's a red herring question. I just don't know why mentoring would be electrified in that way when in fact everybody does it. Everybody does it. In fact, without mentors, where would any of us be?
Excellent. All right, so it's interesting that you mentioned analytics. Natalie Bankovich had a question about key performance indicators. Natalie, if you're still with us, can you unmute your mic and ask your question?
Yeah, you mentioned that would one of the things that you'd like to see companies use
Mhm.
more, and I'm curious if you could give some examples of what that might look like in
Sure.
personal performance or in a department evaluation.
Yeah, and I'm actually going to ask Omari to chime in here because he's done this work too. So let's talk about talent velocity. How much time does it take for somebody to move from one role to another, given their workload, given their level of responsibilities? How many times of the people that are recruited in, let's say, a recruiting class or in a cohort, how quickly do they not only move, but where do they move? Oh, Mario, maybe you have a few suggestions too.
Yeah, I actually I think Dr. Nunery, you're right on you're on the right track, right? It's thinking about who do you have in your organization, how are you noticing them? I'm even reading over here about even riffing off your last comment on the difference between mentorship and sponsorship, right?
Mhm.
Knowing who people are, knowing where the opportunities are, enables you to kind of move people along the track. So
Yeah.
I love that.
And I also think, Natalie, it's a great question. The lack of KPIs has been startling, again, as we've taken more surveys and done more asking. So again, we're even querying, well, not just how many people do you have situated of different types, the diversity piece, but equity in terms of pay gaps. Are women in your organization paid as well as men or differently? And I think we know some of the answers to that. So I think the key is, are companies really waking up to that? Recognizing also, you see business insurance and all the different periodicals that go out. People are switching companies. They don't leave the industry, they change jobs. If I'm running a company, a carrier, a TPA, whatever it is, I'm going to be jealous of my folks and say, no, I got to keep you. What is it going to take for me to keep and work with you? And I think that's how you start to do the measurements.
Okay. Thank you.
So Christopher Harper, I think you had a question. You're up next.
First and foremost, thank you, Dr. Nunery, for providing us with your insight and your knowledge. We are very blessed to have your presence here tonight. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I'm also a Penn grad, so I guess we share that in common.
There you go. You're
All right,
considerably younger than I am, though, so.
Maybe just by looks, but I don't know about age.
No,
Dr. Nunery, the title of your webinar is "Can We Underwrite the New Future?" As everybody here is an insurance professional, and risk management is what makes us eat, sleep, and breathe.
yes.
We're in the business of risk transfer. So the ultimate question is, who are we transferring the risk to, and what premium do we pay for that risk transfer? I assume that the future generations are the named insureds. And again, it's not more of a question, but more of a philosophical question, asking you to kind of generate some fruitful conversation for the group at large.
This is what's so fast. If you remember, one of the probing questions is there risk in adopting diversity, equity, inclusion as an attitude, as a culture? I've been asked that, and Omari, I know you have so many times, well, what's the business case for doing it, right? And it's funny because, again, you all do the task day in and day out of risk transfer. As a banker, we used to do the same thing. The same parameters you use, we use for character, competence, capacity, collateral. I mean, we used there were 5 C's. I forgot what the 5th one was now. Credit, that was the other one.
Credit.
So it's all about risk. Everything's a negotiation. I don't know that we are transferring risk so much as we are sharing risk. In other words, if we bring in folks who have different abilities, different mindsets, they come with a different perspective, they speak a different language, can we actually produce something that's better, more far-reaching? I can tell you, I won't describe the company, but there's some companies I am working with that really understand this and are using it as a comparative advantage as they respond to RFPs. So what they've actually done, Christopher, is transfer the risk to their competitors to say, look at us.
All right.
We not only have folks of different stripes sitting in front of you, but we also get you. And look at our competitors, and some of them are the big behemoths. I won't go into any names. They have 100% risk because they have nobody. And so if there's a risk transfer issue here, it's really about saying, look, I adopt a diverse culture, an equitable culture, an inclusive culture, because just like a diversification of a portfolio, I can I can hit the highs and lows better. And I'm tapping into, Christopher, markets that I've never tapped into before. I think CPCU Rhode Island ought to do what it can to take the stigma out of being a CPCU, if there is one, and the risk of getting there. And just like the Actuarial Foundation, push more into saying, wait a minute, we can grow more people. That will also help to diversify the risk by getting more people in who understand how to underwrite, who understand how markets are evolving. So long-winded answer to your question.
Thank you very much.
So I have a question for all of you. What's your next move? What is it that some of you can type it in the chat or say it out loud. Based on what you've heard tonight, what do you want to do? What's your move when it comes to this? Some of you I know will say, I'm not going to say anything, but you're in a safe crowd. There's only about 72 of us.
We're being
Hello,
shy.
I don't know if you guys can hear me.
Yes, we can,
Um,
Alonzo. Good to hear from you.
in terms of, I ended up coming in very late, unfortunately. But from the tail end, my next move, in terms of underwriting the future, I would have to say, would be being more cognizant and actually going after what I assume is the risk. I'll tell a brief story. The reason I got into selling life insurance was 2008, 3 days before Mother's Day. I got shot 5 times in front of my mother.
Mhm.
So I want to go after those who are considered risky,
Yeah.
and live those kind of lifestyles, and maybe help them avoid the pitfalls that I ran into.
Hey, man, I think, Alonzo, that is a beautiful statement, because think about what just happened last summer and even what just happened about a month ago. What are people, they're upset about a lot of things, but a lot of it is about inequity. I don't think I'm being treated fairly. My life is not what it should be. That American dream that my father chased, moving from Norwood, Virginia to Inglewood, New Jersey, he was trying to chase it just like everybody else here. 2 cars, a house, a vacation every once in a while, send your kids to school. That's what I was trained to do. And it's harder now for my adult kids to build a life that ultimately I've had, because they're still in my pocket some way, shape, or form. But your point is, Alonzo, if you can transfer, using Christopher's language, transfer knowledge to people about how insurance works. That's why something like the Big I does with the Invest program is so important. For free, you can bring insurance information to kids. Why can't CPCU, or I'm not just picking on that association, but in the independent agents of Rhode Island, can we help? And I'm sure you're already doing this, Mark. Can we help bring more literacy around finance, around savings, around investment, around property to people, not because they happen to all have to be capitalists. It's because we know that with safety, it's Maslowian. If you have safety and security, you're able to move forward to that next sense of awareness. So I love what you've said. I see some other ideas popping up here. Let's see.
So Lee, I think what we want to do, because we did have 3 people
Yes,
who had been waiting patiently
yes,
to
please
ask
let them
questions or
go.
make comments. So we're going to go to Zachary, and then after Zachary, we're going to go to Brad, and then after that, we're going to go
Okay,
to Therese.
excellent. Zachary, is he there?
I think Zachary had to.
He had to leave, I
Oh,
believe.
okay, all right. I'll
Okay.
do my I listen to Urban View every morning, so I'll be Joe Madison and
Oh
like
my
you
God.
know. All right, so Brad, you're up then.
Thanks, Tracy. Hi, Dr. Nunery. Thanks for being here today with us. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
So my question kind of dovetails off of the earlier one with regards to KPIs and metrics, but it's a little bit more focused on the idea of where do we start as an industry, and then focused more into where do we start in our own organizations. I know some organizations already are looking at metrics. Some have already
Right.
implemented metrics, and
Mhm.
that's huge for this space. I think it's great that they're already doing that, and they're already tying it to performance. They're already tying it to compensation. So they're definitely leaders in that space. I think more of us need to do that. But when I think about diversity and I think about equity, I feel like those are 2 areas that are probably fairly easy to measure. The one that is a little bit more tough to measure in my mind is inclusion, or this sense of belonging. How do you measure that, right? It's maybe by survey. So I'd like your thoughts on that first. And then the second part of the question is, I looked at that 73% statistic doesn't have metrics around DEI. And I wonder if that's because of the fact that our organizations are afraid of what the benchmarks will show. So
yeah.
when we first have
Absolutely.
those metrics and we
Absolutely.
first say, these are going to be our metrics, we need to establish a baseline. Well, this is our baseline. And
Yep.
we know in the back of our minds, right? It's what we haven't talked about for decades and decades, is that the numbers aren't going to reflect good things, right? They aren't going to reflect the people that we help every day. So I wonder, in your opinion, do you think perhaps all of our organizations that we have, CPCU Society, and all the other organizations you've worked with, maybe having them come up with perhaps standardized metrics or standardized KPIs as, these may be ones that your organizations should work towards identifying, might be a way to push the conversation forward rather than looking at individual organizations being leaders and then other organizations copying what they're doing.
So you asked a couple of really big questions. I'll try to answer them. No, and so not only great questions, but they would actually be you and I may have to collaborate here on another webinar. And I see you work for Gallagher, right?
Yes.
So what Gallagher has done, and some companies are trying to also do this, as you know, probably has Gallagher Connect Partners, where they, like for my company, have engaged a number of organizations of diverse type, veteran-owned, women-owned, disadvantaged companies as part of their network. So when they go out to pitch to the city of Chicago for whatever the insurance coverage may be, they bring along a partner, and that partner shares in the revenue. So to me, that's inclusion in a different way. I think a lot of times we're always thinking about inclusion as who's sitting around the table and does everybody feel good? And I think that's really important. And you're right, culture surveys really play an important role. But it's also about how you do business. Do you spend your money with those companies that, while they may have to, struggle to reach your standard, they actually grow, and because they hire other people, because they engage people in the communities, and they are rooted in their communities, they actually produce long-lasting goods. It's the velocity of money from macroeconomics. So I think some of the KPIs are missing, Brad, to your very good question. Second part of it is because, and I've been told this, and I'm looking at some of my colleagues even here, people don't want to tell that truth. Because if the numbers really do hit the table, it's not going to look so great, but we got to start somewhere. And if all of you at this hour of night on a cold February evening are willing to hang in there and get fired up about what you can do, I'm encouraging you to be champions for your own cause. Because if you're a straight white male, you may think, well, this diversity thing ain't for me. Guess what? It will be. And so the other thing to me is, as somebody in his 60s, I'm trying to do this and maybe hit Powerball, and then I'll see you all later. But if that doesn't happen and I have to keep working, I want to work with people who are intelligent, who are turned on, who really want to get something done. And that's why this kind of collaboration is so important. So I think what's happening, Brad, is that inside companies, more employees, ERGs, inclusivity councils, I'm working with some, are actually no, we don't want you to look like you look, and we don't want you to behave like you behave. Those microaggressions we're calling out. So everything you saw out on the streets of every city in America is coming inside these companies, and people are starting to wake up to say, we can't do what we used to do. We cannot be risk averse at a time when we should actually be taking on this whole idea of diversity, equity, inclusion.
All right, so I'm going to be very self-indulgent here. Our final speaker is going to be Therese Nelson, and I'm going to embarrass her and let you all know that she is my eldest daughter. She is the founder of Black Culinary History and has been blowing up the chat with private messages to me about how much she's getting out of this presentation. So Therese, we certainly love to hear from you.
I was just supposed to be listening. This has been super interesting. Dr. Nunery, this has been brilliant. And the question I had really, I think, ties a lot into the last question. But I was so impacted by your mention of Black North. I work in the food space in the hospitality conversations we're having around DEI, Black North comes up a lot. And I've not seen a lot because it's Canadian-based initiative. Right. So there hasn't been a lot of, there haven't been a lot of deliverables front-facing that we've been able to see in terms of results and like industry buy-in or sort of business buy-in, but it feels like, to the last person's question, they provide a sort of framework for businesses to think about how to include these frameworks into your organization. And so I'm wondering if you have any insight in terms of how it's being received, because it's a relatively new initiative. Yes.
It is, and Teresa, first of all, congratulations on your company. I understand are you a Culinary Institute of America grad? Is that right? Do I remember that right?
I am absolutely not. I'm a Johnson & Wales graduate.
Johnson & Wales. See, here I go messing up again. Well,
no, but I'm teaching at CIA right now as well.
Oh, that's what it was. Okay, I remember from my conversation with Tracy, she was bragging on you. So your mom is proud of what you're doing. Ultimately, you're right. Black North Initiative, the CEOs for Action, what President Biden is doing, a lot of it seems like it's 30,000 feet away from the problem, but you got to have leadership talk about it and put it in the air. President Biden went over to the Pentagon today to talk about diversity inside the military. Okay, he said, well, geez, that doesn't involve me, but it does. It does, because if people start to understand that there is an opportunity, access to opportunity is one of the first barriers. And if you can start to break that down and get people to understand that, look, I may look or feel different than you, but doggone it, I can do this work. And just like what I'm doing, I can actually match up, and I'm doing this actively, match up some African-American owned companies with carriers and agencies. We're talking about live business that they are ready to do in surety, in medical stop loss. It's happening. So part of it is, Therese, to your good question, sometimes we've just got to keep everybody honest. If you said this, what you're going to do, are you doing it? And I think with efforts like this, dialogues like this, and we'll have follow-ons whenever anybody wants, I think there's a change in the air. What Jack Salzwedel said is right. It's a movement, not a moment. I think more people are tied into this. At least that's my hope. And I want to just say thank you for each of you for participating, because you wouldn't hang in there if you didn't think there was something there for you to buy into. Tracy did it again. Tracy?
I kept trying to mute myself when I wasn't speaking to follow my own instructions and make sure I wasn't giving feedback. But so what I'd like to do now, this has just been fantastic. I do want to mention that we are going to make the recording available. There was some really good conversation in the chat, so we are going to preserve a transcript of that chat and share it with everyone. So what I'd like to do now is give Omari and Mark an opportunity to have some remarks. I believe Nick had to step off for another event, but Omari, we're going to throw to you first.
Good evening, everyone. And Tracy, thank you so much. And again, just really appreciate your leadership on pulling all of us together. Dr. Nunery, you did it again. So, sir, it is always a pleasure to listen to you and your insights, and you just have a fantastic way of framing things for us and continuing to challenge us for those of us that are in your audience. One of the things that Dr. Nunery mentioned in his comments and one of the recommendations was Eugene Mitchell. And I'm pleased to say that Eugene will be with us next week, next Thursday, 6:30 to 7:30, as part of NIA Boston's Black History Month series. So I will put the Eventbrite link for that in the chat. And there's a flyer that goes along with that. So if anyone needs it, please reach out to us at niaboston@gmail.com. I won't belabor any more time, just to say that, this celebrating Black History Month is always an opportunity for us to reflect on the past, to understand what is happening in our present moment, for us to really kind of look around at our current environment, and for us to think about what the future can and should look like. And I think we heard amazing guidance tonight on when we exit the insurance industry, whenever that may be, that we are leaving the industry better than we found it, and an industry that hopefully at that point will start to reflect the world that we live in. So really just appreciate you all for joining tonight. And Tracy, thank you so much for having us.
Appreciate you, Omari. Mark, are you still with us?
I am here, yes. I certainly don't have anything quite as profound as Amari had just then, you know, because I'm just not that deep. But you know, and I'll also mention, you know, the fact that the doctor shared pen with another one of the participants. The only thing I have is a pen. That's as close as I got to the University of Penn, although I went to Penn State. What I want to say is, first of all, Tracy, thank you so much for allowing us to be a part of this this evening. You know, I am fortunate in that I met Dr. Nunery over a year ago and have had a number of conversations with him. And the one thing I'll observe is that when I start feeling like, and this has happened, where I felt like we weren't getting anywhere, he kind of lifts you up and says, "Here's what you need to do." You know, as we talked about all these things this evening, a lot of those were like corporate in nature, large companies. And for agents, it's a much smaller dynamic. It's macro versus micro. But, you know, the one thing I am exploring is I'll be reaching out to the Urban League of Providence, because they actually have a scholar program. And, you know, our biggest issue for the independent agents, and I can't speak for Nick, but he's left, is finding talent for the future.
Right.
And quite frankly, you know, we talked about the perceptions of how people look at the industry, that sort of thing. And there's a need to knock down those walls. And I think the more we extend ourselves and reach out to different organizations who may have individuals who would be suitable and quite frankly, extremely successful in the business at the micro level, that's what I think we need to focus on. So Dr. Nunery, it's great to see you. Tracy, it's nice to meet you. I'll meet you in
It's a
person
pleasure.
at some
Yes.
point, but
Yeah.
thank you so much for allowing us to be a part of this evening. And thank you, Omari, as well. Yeah, and you know, I was really shocked because Omari reached out to me on LinkedIn and said, "Hey, you want to connect?" I'm like, "Absolutely." So I hope everyone stays safe and well. And thank you very much again. I appreciate being a part of this.
And Tracy, before you go on, I see Paul Tetro here from the Insurance Library. Good to see you, my friend. He's also been a great supporter and resource, and we'll be talking soon.
Yeah, it's nice. We got Paul. I'm a big fan of Paul. Tony Conyers from Insurance Nerds.
Yeah.
We've got part of our CPCU family from the Pacific Northwest here. My sister friend Precious Norman Walton from Dallas. And you know, there's too many folks here to name, but I do hope that, you know, speaking of movements, that this type of collaboration, you know, that this event is the start of that type of collaboration as we move forward, because there's a synergy that happens when we pool our resources and work together so that that whole becomes greater than the sum of those parts.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. So again, we are going to make the recording available to everyone, as well as the transcript from the program. Yeah, the details of events and things like that will be in there as well. But I would encourage everyone to just, you know, connect, link up with people, and hopefully we will see you all soon at the next either CPCU, NIA Boston, or Independent Agents of Rhode Island event. Everyone have a wonderful and restful evening, and be good to each other.
That's right. Take care. Good night.